The i5 is Fosi Audio's very first headphone, which is a full-sized open bag featuring a 97mm planar magnetic driver. Many thanks to Fosi Audio for sending over a sample for the purpose of this review. Having just mentioned that these are full-sized headphones feels dishonest. The reality is that the i5 is huge. Everything feels scaled up. At 527 grams, without the cable, he's a chunky boy. But I wouldn't let that be a deciding negative factor. My old HE500 at 500 grams is dwarfed by the i5, so there's clearly some clever weight saving being done here. The very top of the headband is thinned out, yet it retains a good high clamping force. The genuine suede leather suspension strap is very soft, thick, and conveniently retains its shape. The sliders use resistive silicone to hold the strap in place with friction. When I first read about that, I was skeptical about its functional quality, but I'm happy to report that it works much better than expected, and no doubt helps keep the mechanical complexity down, which in turn might help reduce costs and increase longevity. So it's great to see some innovation and not just another copy and paste headphone. Talking about mechanical complexity, or lack thereof, the ear cups swivel around infinitely, but there is mechanical damping in the hinge, so it's not awkward and doesn't feel cheap. The ear pads are hybrid fenestrated pleather and mesh fabric with some very plushy feeling foam, which behaves and feels very similar to memory foam. The pads are huge, with an internal depth of 3.5 centimeters, 8 centimeters in height, and 5.5 centimeters of width. Not only that, but the amount of surface area these pads have that comes into contact with your head is also vast. So to mention again the high clamping force of the headband, these are just about one of the biggest head-hugging headphones around today, and despite the weight are very comfortable to wear. After an hour or two, I get a small hot spot where the suspension strap touches my head, but it's more of a warm spot as it doesn't get painful, just noticeable. Realistically, you can't beat gravity. Over half a kilo of headphone has to be felt somewhere. I think only a handful of headphones ever gave me this kind of head-hugging feeling, like the Head Audio headphone, albeit to a smaller degree. The earpads are held on with what looks like Velcro. When I first saw this, my heart sank a little. Any isodynamic, orthodynamic, flat drive, magnetostatic, planar magnetic enthusiast will tell you that Velcro is no way to create a consistent bass seal. After taking a measurement on the mini DSP ears, I wrapped the mounting area with tape and remeasured. There was no difference. So this was the first big indication that this was no ordinary planar. Removing the pads reveals 85mm of active driver area, and the next indication of being a bit different. Technically, the idle planar driver diaphragm is designed to have as close to an even pistonic driver motion as possible, yet here, in order to connect the end of the trace to the terminal, the driver has been pop riveted at the edge of the active area, which also leaves an actual hole through the diaphragm, making these similar to the Sennheiser HD800s. Seriously though, I'm not sure why they've done this, and I hope that it's something they fix in their future projects. Blowing air onto the driver reveals the third big difference. You can hear the diaphragm resonate like a drum skin as air passes around it and between the magnets. The driver diaphragm tension is much higher than usual. To remove the pad mounting plate, you only need to unscrew these 4 hex screws, which reveals that the headphone cups are solid, single machined pieces of walnut that have been fabulously finished on the outside to a high gloss. The aluminium grills on the outside are held by another set of 4 screws. On either side of the driver are foam gaskets, ensuring a proper mechanical and acoustic seal. And now we can get a good look at the driver and how everything comes together. And finally, at the bottom of the cups, where the 3.5mm stereo sockets reside. The cable is mostly great. The main length of it is very thick and pliable, and is a shorter length than average. It does, however, have one flaw. Unlike the JVC HADX1000 cable, which is even thicker and longer than the i5 cable, after the Y-split, the girth is greatly reduced to ensure flexibility and wearing comfort. The i5 cables are only incrementally thinner, and the combined girth of both cables is thicker than the main cable, which just doesn't feel right and is a bit unwieldy. In any case, the build quality is sublime, and I fully expect to be using this cable for the next 50 years. Considering the price of these headphones, especially the discount for backing it early, you get so much headphone for the money, in quantity of physical material and engineering quality. Now let's talk about the sound. I want to start by saying that since these arrived in my lap, I haven't wanted to listen to music with anything else. So while the i5 and I have been enjoying a fairly long honeymoon phase, I can tell you already that it's not just a phase, and I do have data to back this up. First of all, it's mostly clear that these are planar headphones from the first moment you hear them. There are certain aspects of the presentation that are inescapable, like the relatively conservative width in the soundstage compared to dynamics, which is found in almost all planars. Fortunately, simply due to the physical scale of these headphones, they have a bigger than average height in the staging, which has a nice effect of scaling everything up. This is something that also translates directly to a conservative level of imaging in 3D games, so the imaging, combined with their great physical weight, makes these less than ideal for long gaming sessions, although after a week since release I've racked up 24 hours on Oblivion Remastered with these in my head, so read into that however you like. Transient response and detail are both great. Going back and forth between these and the Hi-Fi Man HE500, it is clear that the detail and treble performance on the i5 is superior. It's also slightly more aggressive, but definitely steps closer to the level of the old Hi-Fi Man HE6 in technicalities. While exchanging emails with Fosi Audio about this headphone, I had to ask them, why does the i5 measure and sound like a Stax sr-lambda? Apparently this was one of the goals in the development of the i5, to get as close as possible to the performance of electrostatic headphones by utilizing an ultra-thin diaphragm and coating. They also shared that the engineers at Fosi Audio deeply admire and try to learn from the technology and sound of Stax headphones. So going back to my initial question to Fosi Audio, yes, the i5 sounds remarkably like a Stax sr-lambda, in this case the normal bias version. The scale and height of the sound, the detail, the extra vivid timbre, and of course the tuning. Now one thing is obvious, the tuning isn't perfect. To reach this level of technical performance in a planar, it was decided to prioritize a faster, more detailed treble sound with a very high diaphragm tension at the expense of sub-bass performance and some overall tonal linearity. At the very least, this little mid-range roller coaster mostly plays within an 8 decibel range at the extremes, which should be within what most people should think sounds correct following most standard curves. The i5 won't play audibly below 20 Hz, which is a bit of a shame, but what looks like a bump at 80 Hz sounds more linear than it looks when performing manual tone sweeps, and adds a very good percussive thump to any music that requires it. But this is where the i5 differs from the sr-lambda. As with a good bass seal, the sr-lambda will measure flat down to 10 Hz, while the i5 measures like an sr-lambda with a break in its seal. Fortunately for some people, this will be exactly how they experience the sound of any sr-lambda or any of Stax's Lambda series and directly related siblings, so mileage may vary depending on your experience, taste, or even the shape of your head. Looking at the treble, the graph here shows a peak at 8 kHz, but when performing tonal sweeps to my ears it sounds more like a treble shelf between 8.5 and 12 kHz. At no point did I find it fatiguing, but I think it's something to be aware of. The i5 is not treble shy. This headphone has one noticeable flaw. So far I've only discovered 3 unique instances where the high tension of the diaphragm actually affects the bass sound in a negative way. And now I'm getting kind of sick of listening to any and all kinds of electronic music in a quest to find more. The point is, when you hear it, you'll know, because it sounds like that one particular bass note has a kind of tight drum skin damped timbre. The most obvious example I found was when listening to Thunder by The Prodigy, which, to be fair, is underperformed by most headphones anyway, so in practice, over 99.9% of music sounds perfectly fine on the i5 anyway, and if you don't even listen to electronic music, then it should be close to 100% of your library. I would recommend using a powerful amplifier with these. Incredibly, these will actually play competently out of a smartphone at around 85% volume, but going up from my phone to the Fosi Audio SK1, for example, made a bit of a difference. Going from the SK1 to my Audio GD NFB 11.28 on low gain mode made a surprisingly obvious step up too, and going from low gain to high gain was another step up, each time gaining just a little bit more control and dynamics. So throw as much power as you have at them, but weaker amps, DAPs, or even your phone with a dongle DAC may be sufficient, so don't let amping be a deciding factor. Just as it is with the sr-lambda series, what this particular tuning does is something like increasing contrast and saturation, to use a photography analogy. Everything is just more vivid, more exciting, more articulate, more punchy, more percussive, more dynamic, and done so in a very tasteful way that was proven by Stax over 40 years ago. Switching back to the sr-lambda, the similarities become just as stark as the differences. The i5 doesn't have the same ethereal, effortless electrostatic timbre and sense of air, but the i5 does give a small but welcome dose of bass and a touch of warmth that is sometimes missing in the Stax. But damn, it's very close. Closer than I think most people would believe, but don't mistake these for an alternative, as the i5 still does feel a touch heavy-handed and one-dimensional in some percussive moments that require more delicate finesse, which could also be heard as being more punchy and fun. But let's keep things realistic. I'm comparing them directly to an electrostatic headphone. Switching from the i5 back to my old trusty Hi-Fi-Man HE500, it's clear that these are more neutral. They bring you back down to earth, a bit like cleansing the palette, back to normal levels of saturation and a more common or average soundstage size. It also goes without saying that the HE500 sub-bass performance is superior and is easily preferable for electronic and heavy metal music. I don't own a single earpad that is a fitting replacement, and holding a few other random pads in place didn't yield any positive results that I could hear, but I don't want to go into any detail since none of them are viable options anyway. I think most people will find the performance of the stock earpads very close to the full potential of the i5. Filling the driver hole inside the rivet, I just used some blue tack, actually makes a fairly big difference, adding a moderate V-shape to the sound. I didn't like it, as it didn't sound natural and is too aggressive on both ends. Yes, I've already tried this mod, and the results actually produced undesirable peaks in the upper mid-range and treble, so the rear mesh is actually doing some tuning, making these more linear. I wouldn't recommend unveiling any planars anyway, just ask some Susvara unveiled owners. With most planar headphones, when you break the seal between the earpad and your head, or even make a large gap floating the headphones over your ears, one thing many people notice is that the bass suddenly gets boosted. In a graph, this usually looks like a hump, very much like the i5's graph, but not always at the same frequency. Performing this modification with the i5 does practically nothing, as has already been demonstrated by my earlier attempt at sealing the Velcro gap with tape. These are not your average planar. If you're quite sensitive to treble in general, then you might want to look elsewhere. The weight will automatically rule these out for a fraction of you too, and another small fraction of measure betas won't even be watching this review at this point. If you're genuinely looking for a brand new planar flavor, where music just sounds so lively and vivid, I can see these becoming a companion to almost any other neutral type planar on the market today. No other planar sounds like this. They are a joy to listen to, and might even be a gateway drug for people who want to try out the closest thing to the Stax Lambda sound without going down the electrostatic rabbit hole in both cost and quirks, or for those who did love the sound but wished for a slightly smoother presentation. I want to congratulate Fosi Audio on making a great first headphone, and they should be very proud of their achievement. They dared to make something different, and I'm all for it. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.